Kings Indian players, welcome. I will show you key positional patterns today to make you a much stronger Kings Indian player. I really believe in the value of this recurrent pattern and chunk training. As you know, in this channel, there are several openings which I lay down and broke down the basic and important positional patterns. And that's the series that is starting today about the Kings Indian. It won't be a comprehensive list, can be part one for this beautiful opening, deep and rich opening called the King's Indian Defense. I won't dive into crazy attacking patterns today, but I will keep it on a strategic and positional level to explain to you why certain moves are played. Okay? That's the King's Indian Defense, as you know, folks, right? It's not for newbies. All we see this needs some basic knowledge of what a King's Indian structure means. Namely, the bishop goes to g7, fianchetto, you're giving the center to white, and later you want to strike in the center with e5 and c5 and so on. Okay, so castle short, very basic and orthodox King's Indian setup. We are so far following Taimanov and Najdorf game. Chess classic from Zurich 1953. You must know your classical games, King's Indian players, and that's your bread and butter this game. e5 directly challenges the center, as you already know, and after knight c6, you really put pressure on that central pawn on d4, and you invite white to push d5, which is the main line. They gain space, but we form this King's Indian pawn chain that is pointing towards the king side, and white's pawn chain is pointing towards the queen side, and now the plans are laid. Knight e1 is one of those typical moves in those structures. That knight's coming to d3, and white also pays way for the pawn to go to f3 to stabilize their center. And now knight e7, very typical. Black is getting ready for the main push, f5. Obviously, King's Indian players, you must know this break f5. Your pawn chain is pointing towards the king side. You have more space towards the king side, and you want to play f5 to create play on the king side. That's also your target. As you know, the king on g1 is your major target, and you want to checkmate the white king on g1. That's one of those ideas in the middle game. Okay? Bishop e3, f5 is on the board. Here comes the first question already. If they take on f5, positional pattern number one. How do you recapture, folks? This way, or this way? What is the most common and usually the strongest way to recapture that pawn at f5? And as you know, every Soviet schoolboy knows g takes f5 is the correct recapture. Why? You tell me. You explain to me why that's much more typical and usually the strongest way to recapture on f5, right? You must know this. It happens all the time. Well, you don't give the e4 outpost to white, because if you take back with knight, then this square on e4 becomes an outpost. No black pawn can chase away that piece on e4 for the rest of the game, right? You don't want to allow this to white. Also, this pawn controls central key square, plus you give yourself a chance to play e4 and to awaken your King's Indian bishop on g7, right? A multi-purpose recapture, capturing towards the center, intensifying your central grip because of those pawns, plus giving yourself those choices as well. e5, maybe even e4 followed by knight e5, and so on, right? Piece activity, of course. Your king is unsafe, some of you might say. No way, right? There is no way for the white pieces to come and attack your king on g8. That's a total misconception. You will play king h8, even rook g8, and you start attacking the white king on the king side in this position. Your pieces are much easier chance to roll towards the king side and attack the king on g1. So that's why after f5, they usually don't take on f5, but play the move f3 as white. Okay? f4 is on the board. Najdorf is forming this pawn chain, because now if you take on e4, folks, comes a second positional pattern. You must also know this from the white's perspective. How should white recapture this pawn on e4? Both options are fine, but one of the options is much stronger and much more logical for white. They just played f3. Please take that move into account. Obviously, folks, f takes e4 is much better for white. Why? I want you to break it down to the why question. Why? Look at the knight on e7, folks. That's your terrible piece. Terrible beast on e7, dominated by the pawn on e4. If you take back with the knight, yes, that knight sits on the outpost, but you also give a chance for the knight to reach f5. That knight becomes an excellent piece on this square all of a sudden, right? So that's why white should have taken with the pawn in its position and bury the knight on e7. Space advantage is so visible here. White's space advantage is limiting that knight. Plus, the bishop becomes a limited piece as well. Typical positional chunks in the King's Indian. Bad King's Indian bishop hemmed in by its own pawn on e5, right? If you take on e4 with the knight, at some point, if that knight is ever challenged on e4, then black can play e4 and activate and awaken that bad bishop too. That's why they first go f3, and if you ever take on e4, they will recapture the pawn. White is the one who is having a long-lasting advantage here because of their better pieces simply. Even this terrible bishop can go to g4 and offer an exchange in this pawn formation. So, f5, f3, Najdorf plays f4 and now sets this new pawn chain into motion. Well, what's the plan for black from this position, folks? You tell me. Of course, you play g5, g4, open up lines on the king's side and checkmate the white king, right? Again, the pawn chain is pointing this way. That's our most advanced pawn. Strategically, you want to place a second pawn next to your most advanced pawn in the pawn chain positions. That's why you go g5, g4, maybe g3 at some point, open up lines and attack the white king. Meanwhile, if you look at the white's pawn chain, it's pointing towards the queen side. Thus, they are playing for the move c5, right? Very typical. Knight e3 supports c5. Najdorf brings all the pieces to the king side, and now we are coming to another key moment. Pattern number 3. Positional patterns in the King's Indian you must know by heart. Well, white slowly wants to play on the queen side. Play takes, knight b5, knight c7 invasions. You see, rook c1 move prepares that idea. I want you to come up with a multi-purpose move for black here that neutralizes this entire plan from white and also bolsters this weakness on d6. They will create a weakness on d6 very soon, so I want you to also bolster that weak pawn in this position. You're a great player if you found the move rook f7 here. So logical, so human, so King's Indian, and so multifunctional. Rook f7, you tell me the points. First point is the rook starts guarding the c7 square against takes, knight b5, knight c7s. Second, terrible bishop. Terrible King's Indian bishop does nothing on g7. Now can go to f8 in this position and to bolster your weak pawn on d6. Plus, this rook can eventually go to g7 or sometimes h7 and join the king's side attack against the white king. That's why I love these multifunctional strategic moves. And once you know them, once you store them in your long-term memories, there's a much higher chance that you will find those moves quickly. Folks, Najdorf plays rook f7 with the basic point that if you take and play knight b5, hitting here, then I'm in a perfect position to play a6 and chase away your knight because your knight cannot really enter into the c7 square. The d6 pawn is already guarded, so your knight has to waste time in going to a3. I can even play b5 to bury your knight completely, and black is slowly taking over the game on the king side once the queen side structure is stabilized. I will even play bishop f8, guard here, and the future belongs to black on the king side. Just to show you how the actual game went, bishop f8, as mentioned, right? Takes. This pawn is guarded nicely by the bishop. They play the move queen d2 in the actual game, folks. And now, once the queen side structure is stabilized, once those weaknesses are guarded, Najdorf played a very typical King's Indian move, g4. Of course, he starts an attack on the king side. I won't show you the entire game, but suffice to say that you should know this move as well. That's a final pattern. Now we are moving to attacking motifs in the King's Indian. That's an episode for a future video, but just to show you the basic point of g3, very typical pawn sacrifice, folks. You sacrifice the pawn to open up the g file first, and you even vacated this f4 square for your pieces. Even the bishop can later on do this, but after knight h5 already here, right? You see the basic point of black. Those pieces are gaining new avenues on the king side. Bishop e7 followed by bishop g5 is coming, and look at the piece activity for black. I will stop here. Just see the effect of the single pawn sacrifice g3. For a single pawn, you created huge piece activity on the king side. Again, once again, because you might ask yourself, okay, g4, but so what? I don't see my next move. Well, that's one of those ideas. At some point, you can play g3. If white takes on g4, your knight is in happy peace, and your bishop is shining on g4 in the structure as well. Black is simply better in this position too. Rook g7s are coming, and this pawn is becoming really, really weak on g2. And if they don't take on g4, you play a very typical, standard pawn sacrifice, g3, and open up lines on the king side, because it's all about the attack against the white king on the king side here. Just very quickly to show you how Najdorf won this beautiful game, not move by move, but just understand the basic gist. See how pieces are flowing towards the king side, step by step. That's an amazing game, folks. Even the final segment is so beautiful. The queen joins the battle. Every single piece is eyeing the king side, and please look at the white pieces. They do nothing over here. Bishop f1, rook f8. Oh boy, every single black piece, right? That's the spirit of the King's Indian for you folks. That's our major target on h1. Black is completely winning in this position, but he plays b5 as well to bury that knight completely. That knight is a shutdown piece. There is nothing for white to do. a4, they want to create the c4 square for the knight. Najdorf says, no, I will just keep a pawn on b5 because I'm limiting your knight even further. Every single white piece are terrible. Even the bishop is terrible because of the pawn chain, and black is a beautiful advantage. Even the final piece is coming to the king side with knight h4. Very typical. Yeah, all these moves are very typical, by the way. Rook f7, later g7, knight g6 to h4, queen g5, knight h5. It's a beautiful and typical model game for the King's Indian players. Suffice to say that I'm stopping here. Black has a winning advantage, because if I continue further, then this video will be too long, and we are lurking into typical attacking motifs in the King's Indian involving some sacrifices. So just for you to understand, see the previous connections of all these ideas and plans for black to allow this position. Again, just to consolidate what we learned so far, that's a student game. Recently, she played this game with the black pieces. She played the move f5, and after they took on f5, how do you recapture, folks? How do you recapture? Yes, you recapture with the pawn. Instead of bishop takes f5, which comes at a tempo on the queen, this allows knight e4, and they keep a stable piece on e4. That's an outpost. Instead of bishop takes f5, she went g takes f5 and allowed herself to play e4 on the next turn. Black is so much better in this position because of their piece activity. And now, once you learn this knowledge, you have a much higher chance of understanding when exactly to take on e4 for black. In this position, that's a game of Anishkiri with the black pieces. White player, instead of playing the typical move f3, he went bishop d2 here. And here comes my question to you. Now, can you please judge the strength of the move f takes e4, folks? What has changed? What has changed? You're a great player if you told me f takes e4 is now a very good move for black. Objectively, the best move indeed. Why? Because your terrible knight is coming into life on f5. If I play the move f3 here, f takes e4 will be bad, because after f takes e4, your knight remains to be a terrible piece, and white has a better position with space. Here, since white didn't play f3 but play bishop d2, now it's your chance to take on e4 as Giri did and play knight f5, right? That terrible piece is now reaching this d4 outpost. You have an outpost on d4 yourself. You see, that's a memory marker for you. F takes e4 can be strongly considered if white did not play the move f3 yet. You're doing it to help your knight. Pawn play always connects to piece activity. You take it to activate your rook, but also activate your knight that is now coming to d4. That terrible piece that could be buried if I play the move f3 here, right? You have a knight problem. Suddenly, that knight can become a hero on this d4 outpost in these positions. There are always exceptions in chess, and I'm showing you why those exceptions hold. One more King's Indian pattern for you, okay? That's a beautiful game. I made a several video about this kind of operation for black, but here it's good to revisit, okay? Black plays all the King's Indian moves. You can even play c5, by the way, folks. You don't have to always play for e5. c5 is also a very typical King's Indian move in those positions. d5, white gains more space, stops knight c6, and so on and so on. But now black plays e5. Now they achieve sort of King's Indian slash Benoni kind of pawn formations. Benoni means the pawn is on c5 and black is a backward pawn on d6. Black achieves this pawn formation. And see, black is still playing for the f5 break in this position, folks. f5 takes. How do you recapture? You tell me. You tell me. What is the best way for black to recapture that pawn? Yes, g takes f5. Every Soviet schoolboy knows that's the best recapture for black. At least that's desirable for black because you keep an eye on the central square. You don't allow an outpost on e4. Plus, you give yourself a chance to play e4 and awaken your bishop on g7, queen c2. White player puts the pressure on the pawn on f5, and here comes my question. Do you know the only move for black that gives black a positional advantage? That's a typical Benoni slash King's Indian operation. Simulated pawn exchange is my final prompt, and you're a great player if you play the move e4. Positional pawn sacrifice. Why do you do that? Because you want to awaken your bishop. White takes. How do you continue? f4. That's what I mean by simulated pawn exchange. Please, folks, you go back, you first play e4 and then play f4. Why? Because not only your bishop became a great piece, you gave yourself a beautiful outpost on e5 for your knight. You vacated the e5 outpost for your knight. Plus, you blunted the white pieces, right? None of them can use this e4 outpost, and the entire battery is blunted as a result. Knight d7 to e5 is coming, and beautiful pawn sacrifice. Black is already better objectively. Folks, if you play f4 yourself, first of all, you drop the pawn, the check. That doesn't work, right? But even this sacrifice wouldn't be possible. Let's say bishop f2 back. Now white can use this e4 outpost for their pieces. Your bishop is a terrible creature. Your knight cannot go to e5. Please compare and contrast this variation with the variation that you first push e4, you induce a pawn on e4 yourself, and then play f4. Beautiful long-term positional pawn sacrifice. Typical Benoni sacrifice was done by Botvinnik, by all the great players. And that's the strength of this video. Once you learn these chunks and patterns, it becomes easy to find and discover in the actual games, right? Very standard, very typical indeed. Also look at the effect of this pawn push on the bishop as well as your knight. Beautiful. Talking about activation of this bad King's Indian bishop, folks, I will show you some key patterns as well. Yeah, very important for King's Indian, of course. In this position, black plays the move f5, which is very typical, very logical. Takes, takes. White opens the g file, and the claim is that the king is in the center, so maybe it's white who will put a piece on the g file. Don't worry, your bishop is a very strong piece. Comes e takes f5. Now, after bishop takes f5, comes the move bishop d3 for white. Okay, it's your turn, black, to play, folks. Can you please tell me a very strong positional operation for black in this position? Ask yourself, what would white play if you don't make a move in this position? Yeah, white wants to exchange those bishops and then place a knight on this beautiful e4 outpost that will stay on e4, that will also blunt your bishop for the rest of the game, right? White wants to use this blockading square e4 to limit your bishop, but also activate their pieces. Thus, there is no time to waste. It's a critical moment for black. And you're a great player if you found the move e4. Very typical, again, positional pawn sacrifice to liberate your King's Indian bishop. That bishop can be the worst bishop in the world if you're careless, but if you act actively like this, then you can create a monster from your King's Indian bishop, fianchetto bishop. So you must always speak to your pieces when it comes to pawn moves in chess. Again, don't forget about this motif. Once you know the existence of this idea, there's a much higher chance that you will achieve and you will make those moves and you will stop white to a full blockade on this e4 square for their knight. The Judith Polgar game with the black pieces. Polgar was a great King's Indian player as well. Here again, the same question. Your bishop is not the best bishop in the world. Please find a way to awaken that piece. And you're a great player, folks, if you want Polgar's move h5. Very typical and standard. h5 followed by bishop h6 will awaken that bishop on this diagonal, especially if this bishop is already exchanged off or if it's placed on a very bad diagonal like this. This bishop can shine on this diagonal, and that's the game continuation, folks. Now the bishop also supports those ideas like knight e3. That's what she played in the actual game. Amazing bishop supporting knight. Very quickly, I will show you what she did with her bishop on this square. h4 also stabilizes this f4 post for the bishop. She gains control on those dark squares. Look at the effect of that amazing bishop on f4. Yeah, that bishop was quite bad on g7. Now she's actually even creating some background problems here. Can go to g3 and so on, blunting that rook and so on and so on. Here, black is already achieving a winning positional advantage. Amazing bishop on f4, right? Imagine the bishop was sitting on f6 or g7. That would be a tall pawn. But here first, she improved the bishop. And later, she found these beautiful, beautiful moves to find a finishing blow. One more pass pawn is created. Judith Polgar went on to win this game by some accurate calculation like this. Rook c4 attacks the bishop. Take on e4 will follow. And this game is totally finished. He resigned in the actual game. And once you know this operation, here, can you find the best plan for black, please? Black to play and find a very good plan. Yes, you're a great player again, folks. In this case, black has the unopposed dark square bishop. White doesn't have a dark square bishop, but right now the bishop does nothing, right? Blunted by the pawn on e5. There's also a full blockade on e4. There is no way for you to get rid of the knight on e4. Thus, you start eyeing new diagonals for your bishop, and you find the move h5, and now your unopposed bishop will show its teeth. You gain control on those dark squares, right? Queen h4 is coming very quickly, showing you until the very end. Queen d8 is coming to hit the bishop. White also has some background problems. You see, bishop can go to f4 and so on and so on. Queen d4 eyes this dark square on g1. There is no way for white to hold this position. The bishop is showing its strength as well, supporting rook c1, follow it up with taking the best piece, because that was the basic guard of the rook on f2. And now this game is finished. White resigned because the rook is dropping if you take on e4. Going back to the pawn chains, folks, I will show you in this segment very important formations, very important ideas when it comes to stopping padlock formation. Padlock formation occurs when one side, the defending side, locks the entire structure. So there is no progress. For example, white already played the move g4 in those positions, folks. Of course, our basic target is the king on g1. So black's goal here is to find a way to open up lines on the king side. And white wants to create a padlock formation. They want to completely lock the king side before focusing on their plan on the queen side. Okay? King's Indian motifs, you must know this by heart. Black to play, folks. There's only one way for black to achieve a small advantage. How do you find that plan? Ask yourself, what's your goal? Your goal is to find a way to open up the king side. If you play the most natural move, h5, to go for the pawn break, you tell me how white will react against your move. Yes, folks, they will first go g5, gain tempo on your knight, follow it up with the move h4, and the entire thing is locked. I will just show you here. h5 will be a big mistake. You allow the move g5, and after knight h7 comes h4, and please look at this formation, folks. Please look at the formation. There is no natural pawn break left for black to open up lines on the king side, and now the only thing you have is a piece sacrifice on g5, but it will never work. White will find a way to defend their king side, and then they will crush you on the queen side with the move c5. Complete lockdown on the king side. There is no natural way for black to make progress. In fact, that's the entire point of this setup for white. If you're careless, white will completely close down the king side. But there is a beautiful move here for black to start the operation. The opening operation is starting with the move, you tell me. Yes, you first go g5, you stop the white pawn from ever reaching g5 themselves, and then your next move is h5. And at least you will find a way to open up the h file by force. It works like Swiss clock, folks. Let's say white plays the move c5 here, you play the move h5. At the very least, you will manage to open up the h file. Something is opening on the h file. Yeah. If they go h3 here, you can take on g4. Sometimes you can play rook f7 to h7. Sometimes king f7, rook h8, and so on and so on and so on. Right? You manage to find a way to create play for your pieces on the king side. Knight g6 to h4, and so on and so on. This is a much more logical way for black to operate on the king side than the move h5 directly, which allows a complete padlock. You're taking much more risk in this line compared to the line that you first go g5 and later go h5. So the basic lesson is this, right? You achieve this pawn chain, but then you must always ask yourself, what is my strategic goal here? I have to find a way to open up the king side and disallow padlock formation. Then you search for moves that both improves your position, but also doesn't allow the opponent to lock down the king side completely. I will show you the critical segments of this instructive game to consolidate what we learned today, folks. Eljanov versus Radjabov. Radjabov is a great model player for King's Indian players. You should watch his games. He played the King's Indian almost his entire career. He has all the positional tricks in his disposal. Okay? I'll just show you some motifs here that really highlights what we spoke about in today's episode. Typical orthodox King's Indian on the board. D5, knight e7, orthodox standard. Even knight e1 is a very standard reaction for white. Knight d7, f3, f5. We've seen all this before. And now white goes g4, right? Interesting move. Well, don't neglect it out of hand. White has a point. What's the basic point? If black plays the most natural move, let's say f4, you tell me. That's my first question. Is f4 a good move or a bad move for black in this position? And now we should have some intuition about this, folks. f4 is a bad move. Why? Because you allow white to achieve the padlock formation by playing h4. Now there is no natural way for black to engage in a pawn break to open up the king side. Why? If you push h5, white will go g5, and now they are locking down the king side, right? There is no progress. And if you go g5, they will go h5, again, locking down the king side completely. So, in hindsight, you must ask yourself, what was the point of g4? Looks like a chess crime. They are playing on the side that their king resides. I'm going to checkmate you. No way. There is no easy way out, right? Now you have a basic understanding of why they are making those moves. Grandmasters. They are inviting you to commit a crime and play the standard looking move f4, only to find out there is no progress. There is no progress for black to make. Because if you make, let's say after h4, you might ask yourself, hey, that pawn might be weak. Let me move the knight or the bishop and attack the pawn. Of course, white should play the move knight g2 and defend the pawn this way. And if you play king h8 to further intensify the attack on h4, they will make moves like this, folks. Knight g8 attacks the pawn as well, but they will defend with bishop e1, and there is no way for black to engage in a pawn break and open up lines on the king side, okay? That is why after g4, Radjabov keeps the tension. Finally, we learn when to keep the tension in the King's Kingdom. That's why it's a very rich opening. Oftentimes, this tension is kept for the entire game. Sometimes they even induce other tension on the board, as we'll see in this game, and they preserve the tension as long as possible. Okay? King h8 was chosen by Radjabov. Sometimes the knight can go to g8 because that's your terrible piece, and you take it from there. Okay? Useful move in the King's Indian, usually King h8. h4, he keeps the tension and plays c6. He wants to sometimes disturb the pawn on d5 and create play in the center of the board. What's the basic point? If white takes on c6 for the purpose of taking on d6 next, well, you see the pawn on h4, queen takes c6, queen takes h4, and black is the one who is already standing better here. That's why c6 is backed by tactics. You see, instead of breaking the tension or pushing f4, he puts more tension into the picture. If you take on e4, by the way, folks, that's a chess crime as well. F takes e4, and that knight is a terrible creature. The bishop is a terrible creature, and there is no way for black still to open up the king side in this position. That's why he doesn't take on e4 either. He waits for white to take on f5 in this position. d6, king g2, knight f6. Again, intensifying the pressure on those pawns rather than releasing the tension. Knight d3, white as well. He keeps full tension on the board, and then comes one more tension-making move, folks. He goes b5. Another beautiful pattern, by the way. b5 simply wants to destroy the pawn chain that is giving white all the extra space, right? These pawns are choking the black pieces, and thus black engages in a pawn break to disturb white's pawn center. If you take on b5, I will take on d5, and your center is crumbling. If you take on c6, I will first take on c4, attack the knight, followed by this, and again black is better. Thus, after b5, white needs to play the move b3, game continuation, to keep the pawn chain intact. But then Radjabov simply keeps the tension and simply improves the rook, getting ready for b takes c4. Look at this. Every single move created and kept the tension for black. Beautiful. This means King's Indian is a multi-dimensional opening. You don't always play like a caveman on the king side. Even though the king is on the king side, you're still playing in the center, but even on the queen side by playing this way. Isn't it beautiful? Knight f2, again, keeping those pawns intact in this position, but then Radjabov finds a beautiful resource b4, well, to chase away the knight that was controlling those central squares. Then he goes bishop b7. Here, strong players will notice what's coming. What are the potential ideas for black in this position? It will all become very evident in this position, folks. cd, cd, it's black to play. Here, after cd, cd, knight g8 was chosen by Radjabov, not the best move. Instead, the best move was now to take on e4. It looks like what is black gaining from this? It's not clear. Comes my question to you. There is one way for black to destroy this beautiful pawn center for white and gain beautiful dynamical play in this position. This repeats in Breyer variation in the rule of pass. This same idea also exists in the Breyer Spanish with the black pieces. So those Breyer players, I'm sure you have some intuition of what's coming right now, and you're a great player if you want to move knight e takes d5. Piece sacrifice on d5. Why? Black gains two central pawns, plus gets amazing pieces, plus the bishop becomes amazing, plus the king on g2 becomes extremely unsafe, plus you gave yourself a chance to awaken your terrible King's Indian bishop as well. Please guys, just go 3 moves before. This bishop is crying, this bishop is dead, the knights are limited by those pawns. Look at this. By sacrificing a knight, terrible knight by the way, terrible knight for 2 pawns, black changed the natural course of the game completely. Please understand why black is engaging in this very typical piece sacrifice for 2 pawns. That's why it's in this video as well, folks. That's a beautiful pattern. And look at the white pieces. They're just completely caught off guard. The knight is in Siberia. The king is on the same diagonal as the bishop, right? White needs to waste time with moves like king h2 as well. And here black, after queen c6, forming a formidable battery on this diagonal, achieves almost winning advantage. For example, rook c1, knight c3, bam! That's coming now. The game is completely finished. White cannot even hold the position because this allows rook f2 check. That's game over. Otherwise, how are you going to defend against queen g2 ideas? There is no chance. Look at this beautiful effect of the knight sacrifice on e4, folks. This will be your homework position, folks. Anish Giri with the black pieces. He played the King's Indian. He reached this position. On the previous move, he just pushed h4 to drive the knight to a terrible post on h1. It's black to play. Black has the bishop pair. White has a knight pair. Typical King's Indian position on the board, right? I'm searching for a good positional move from black in this position that gave black completely winning position. There are of course several good moves, but there's one that is so beautiful to see. Even go to one of my courses. You know exactly which course I mean if you are following my courses deeply, okay? This is only the first part. King's Indian is a deep ocean. I'm sure I will make several other videos on the patterns and chunks that are closely connected to the King's Indian defense. Later on, I will make a video about the attacking motifs when it comes to the King's Indian, typical sacrifices, piece maneuvers, and piece placements, and so on. This video would get too long if I put everything into a single chunk. I'm sure you will get great lessons from this. Please ask me anything on YouTube, give me feedback, and please like and subscribe if you like this video, and please share it with a friend that you think would benefit from its content. That's very important for me to be able to keep producing videos that actually help you get better in this beautiful game, folks. Wishing you all the best. Now go and crush those white players. Bye-bye.